Perfect. So it works. Yay. A warm welcome to all of you joining us today for this CSS Web Talk. It's 10:30 here in Zurich, and I am Jurgena Kamberai, a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies here at the ETH University. I am joined today by Christoph Ammann from Swiss and Michael Marty from Axpo, and we are going to talk about crisis management in practice. We will look at two sectors where absolute reliability is expected every single day, but then sometimes disruptions can just be around the corner. So these two sectors are the aviation and energy. Before we start, a quick housekeeping note. We will have time for your questions at the end, so please feel free to drop them in the chat at any point, and my colleague Lisa here will bring them into the discussion later on. And so for this web talk in crisis management, we wanted to look at the aviation and energy sector because in both worlds, a seemingly minor problem can snowball into a major crisis if it's not caught or managed in time. And this really makes them the perfect starting point for a much broader conversation or discussion on how to handle disruptions. And we're going to look at this through two interconnected lenses today. On one side, we will have the individual and then the organization. This is because crisis management first is about people. It's the individuals who can act under intense pressure or navigate uncertainty and even make tough calls when maybe the picture is not fully clear. But on the other hand, crisis management is also about organizations who set up the structures, the routine, and if the culture that allow the people to succeed to actually perform their tasks. So I know that we have a very diverse audience with us today, researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and I guess also policy shapers. And my hope is that we leave this web talk with a much more honest picture of what really crisis management actually demands in the real world. And I think this is a very important conversation because crisis management is really not only or not anymore the task of blue light organizations or crisis specialized teams because I mean the complexities or the interdependencies that we observe today, many organizations need to understand how they function under pressure. That means how they decide, how they coordinate, or act when the routines that they have established are actually disrupted. So this also matters for the public administration. So I'm glad that some policymakers are here with us today, but also for security policy because disruptions rarely stay in one place. We've seen it many times. A technical problem can quickly become an organizational problem, a political issue, and then even transform into a wider societal challenge. So for those of you who are new to our network, this is exactly what we do here at the CSS. As a research and a think tank center at the ETH Zurich, we focus on Swiss and international security policy. And these web talks are a bit our way of building a bridge between academic research and real world practical experience. And today I'm very, very happy to build this bridge with two major experts in their field, respectively. First, let me introduce Christoph Ammann. Christoph actually started out studying physics here at the ETH before taking it to the skies. He is an airline pilot he has been an airline pilot for 35 years and an instructor for over 3 decades. Currently, he's flight instructor, right? He's a captain and a
Yes.
flight instructor on the Boeing 777. And beyond the cockpit, he has held several senior management roles within the Lufthansa Group and also served as a reserve major in the Swiss Army and Air Force. So, Christoph, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
What makes Christoph's perspective so valuable today is that aviation has spent decades studying decision making under pressure, human factors, and finding that delicate balance between strict procedures and human judgment. Our second speaker is Marty. Michael studied political science here in Zurich and spent years working at the intersection of security and crisis management. He previously served as scientific advisor to the Chief of the Armed Forces and also worked as Chief of Staff and Emergency Response Officer within a cantonal police force. 3 years ago, he joined Axpo Group, which is Switzerland's largest producer of electricity, and he's responsible for the group crisis management and emergency management coordination. He still serves as a colonel in the general staff in the Swiss Army. So, Michael, welcome. Very glad you're here with us today as well. Michael brings the vital organizational perspective. So he looks at how you structure crisis management in a sector where a single disruption can instantly impact infrastructure authorities, but also the general public. So now, before I hand it over to our experts, I want to take a moment with you and share three things that we have learned as researchers from our daily work. So by doing research, and I would like you to think of this as maybe three lenses to keep in the back of your mind as you listen to Christoph and Michael. And I'm really curious to hear if these concepts or points resonate with their experience, but also with yours in the audience. So the first one is that being crisis proof is not just one attribute. As researchers, one of the questions that we keep coming back to is what actually makes a system resilient or crisis proof? Is it maybe redundancy? So having a backup system? Is it centralization so that decisions can be faster? Or is it the opposite maybe? So dispersing functions so that no single point of failure can take everything down. And to answer to these questions, we looked at this in one of the most extreme contexts actually, which is the war in Ukraine. Despite enormous pressure, Ukraine still manages to maintain the operation of its critical infrastructure sectors, so that essential services such as transportation or communication can continue, and in many cases, even though at a reduced level. And what we found is that resilience, so being resilient, is not just, yeah, Christoph?
Wait a moment.
Christoph? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'll be back just one
Yeah,
second.
no problem.
I'm sorry.
Hey, this is also part of working in crisis management.
Yeah.
Um, so looking at this, looking at the case study of Ukraine, is that what we really realize is resilience is not just one single attribute, but it's rather a combination of different things. It can be redundancy in some places, decentralization in others, or even improvisation where neither of the two is possible. And often it's really people that make decisions in conditions that nobody really designed procedures for. So systems can be built to absorb stress, but at some point, what holds them together is not the architecture, but it's the people that are inside this system, so these organizations. The second concept I want to bring is that when nothing goes wrong, we slowly lower our guard without even noticing that. And this is what Diane Vaughan, she is a professor at Columbia University. She described this in her work on the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986. The technical problem that led to the disintegration of the shuttle had been known actually for years, and engineers had raised concerns. But because previous launches had been successful, actually, the organization gradually started treating the risk as acceptable. So the exception became normal. And she called this phenomena the normalization of the deviance. And this is not, I think, just a NASA problem. It can happen in any organization that manages risk over time. So maybe a shortcut starts feeling like reasonable, a warning sign can become background noise that we start ignoring. A temporary maybe workaround becomes a standard practice, and then we slowly feel that risks stop feeling like risk. And I think this can also be an interesting point to further discover. Lastly, I think what we have learned as researchers is that if you prepare well, your preparation becomes invisible. And in research, we actually call this the preparedness paradox. So when preparedness works, nothing actually happens because the disruption remains small and the system actually continues to function. And ultimately, the crisis is avoided or contained. But this creates a small problem because successful preparedness leaves very visible proof of its own value at an individual or even institutional level. So at an individual level, preparing, for a major disruption, do you have candles at home? Do you have water or food for 7 days? So we prepare, but we don't see the actual value of preparing. So it's much easier to see the cost of preparedness than the crisis that did not happen because people actually were prepared. And over time, this can actually create or lead to the wrong pressures where we have fewer exercises, fewer lessons learned implemented through exercises, less training, simpler procedures, or less investments ultimately in the crisis management structure. So I suspect that both our speakers, as well as you in the audience, may recognize these dynamics. But with these three ideas in our minds, let's move from theory to practice. So let's start with the individual perspective. And for that, I will turn to you, Christoph, because aviation is famous for its strict procedures, intense training, and safety culture. Yet, even in these highly regulated environments, pilots still have to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. So please take us into that world. What does it actually feel like when the environment changes rapidly in the cockpit? What kind of pressure shape your decision, and how do you actually train pilots for those moments? So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Regina. The let me start with a phenomenon that is maybe obvious but not really well known, and it's the fact that uh, aviation today is very safe. We all know it's very safe statistically and from our own experience. And the thing with a safe environment is that the next big unsafe event will be something nobody has thought of. That's one of the things that we are facing every day. And and the problem with this is that if you want to prepare for something nobody has ever seen and nobody has ever thought of, then you're outside of all your regulations and your procedures and your probably also preparation. There are, fortunately, answers to the question, how do we prepare for something nobody thought of? But that's the world we live in, and that's the side, the sort of thing we're trying to prepare. Now, our preparation for all of this, for the unexpected events and for everything we know, has several sides. The first of it is what you mentioned with preparedness. What we try to do is we want to be ready, and we do some sort of risk management on all kinds of levels, from organization to the individual pilot and also technical side of it. Then when the crisis hits in any kind of way during a flight, then what we try to do is have a certain systematic for crisis management in the cockpit. And it's probably important to remember that whenever a crisis hits during a flight, then time is limited. Not only because the crisis might be urgent or the problem might be deteriorating, but also because any flight is limited by flight hours, by fuel, by the time we have in the air. So by definition, our crisis management has time limits, and they're very short compared to what I expect what Michael will tell us later on. We don't linger on for days, most probably not even hours in our sort of crisis management on the sharp end of things. That's not true for organizations, it's not true for technical preparedness, but that's our, if you want, the pilot view of crisis management. And then the third element that is and has been very important in aviation is that once something has happened, it may be spectacular. In all the spectacular cases, this has been the case, but it may also be a small thing. We try to review, we try to investigate, we try to learn from it. Again, and this is sort of full circle then, to be able to learn about things we didn't know about beforehand and how we could try and prepare for something we still don't know about. So this is, if you want, the basic three levels of how we try to prepare for crisis. And the two phenomena you were mentioning, I just want to come back to them just for completeness. The lowering the guard thing, the space shuttle in 1986. One of the elements there, and it's a complicated issue, of course, but one of the elements there was pressure, right? All sorts of commercial and political pressure to move on. And that's also one of the things we're looking at, how pressures and how expectations from several sides may influence decisions that are concerning risks. Our world is not simple enough for us to just say we have safety first and that's it. Because if safety was first in every aspect, we wouldn't be flying, right? So we need to weigh aspects of safety versus pressures or ideas or demands from other sides. And here's where the pressures to operate can become dangerous, even though they seem natural. And that's where also the space shuttle accident in 1986 was sort of a victim, because the pressure to operate and the pressure to go was so big that compromises were made and the risks were sort of ignored that shouldn't have been ignored, right? And the third thing you mentioned was that once that preparedness is becoming commonplace, it becomes invisible and ends up being a cost factor more than a necessity. And that is one of the things we also deal with, of course, and in aviation, accidents tend to have a high visibility. So the regulators have also been on this issue and have started to mandate minimum standards for preparedness in all sorts of ways. So there are minimum standards. Now the question here is, are these minimum standards good enough, always good enough for what we do? And one of the, if you want, the nicer statistical things that you can learn out of accidents is that the more operation you do, the more flights you do, the safer you have to be in order to avoid or limit the number of incidents and accidents. So a regulatory mandate for some preparation may not be enough just because you're growing and your operation is, and that's the case globally, but also for individual companies. The more flights you do, the safer you have to be in order to have the same safety standards that you have to continue with the growing operation. Right. So does that make sense?
Yeah,
Should I
no,
stop here?
perfect. No, that's perfect. And I'm very happy that you picked up a bit on the things that we have researched, because again, you as an expert can give them a bit of a different twist or practical twist. Often we tend to research without looking actually at the practicality of our ideas or the results. I would like to go back a bit to what you said before about you mentioned here the pressure. So managing pressure and expectations, which is actually one of the most difficult things that you need to handle as a practitioner. And I bring a bit of a small example from my daily life. I'm generally a person that is very active and, I like to interact, etc. But as a firefighter, my commandant told me, Jurgena, whenever you enter in a building and there is a smoke, you really need to take it slow because obviously as a practitioner all you want is to save someone, so you have in mind safety, but as you said before, safety is not enough. So I really needed to, even at the individual level, I needed to take my time to do things, but in your case maybe time is not enough. So how do you actually, so what are the traits that you are training the pilots with? So what are the, the personal specific characters that you look for in the pilot, and how can you infuse the confidence or the fact that pressure is felt but also is managed somehow?
Well, if I understand you correctly,
Yeah,
the broader sense of your question here is human factors. So as a
exactly.
firefighter, you need to be able to control yourself when entering a building with smoke, right? You want to have a very systematic and controlled way of entering that building in order to have your effectiveness deployed at the place where you want it. You don't want to have another human being in a house with smoke, but you want to have a firefighter able to do something about it. So human factors is something uh, that's very close to my heart, and is also part of our training, in the sense that we not only learn about what human factors or how human factors can be important for handling all sorts of situations, not only crisis, but also because people need to learn about themselves. Just like you said, you need to learn about yourself. How do I behave when I enter that building full of smoke? We want the pilots and we want the flight attendants to know how they react under pressure. So now the question here, and it's always the question, how do we train things like that? How do we put people under pressure in training so that they can learn about themselves and they can learn successful ways of dealing with the situations that they might be in later on. And training effectiveness is a whole other issue for and a field of study, and very, very interesting. But the bottom line is we need to know about how we operate in a situation under pressure, and we need to learn to be effective under pressure. And that also has the the aspect of having experience with it. So all, or very much of what we do in the direction of your question, is that we try to give people experience when they are under pressure and when they try to solve problems, and we try to give them structures to lead them on, and give them, if you want, hints and tips. So we have a basic structure for every sort of crisis, every sort of non-normal situation, where they can start doing things, even though there's no checklist for it. They can start doing things in a systematic way, and make sure that they have previous experience, not in the case necessarily, but working with the structure that they get. And at the same time, of course, it's important to tell them, look at yourself during training, try to find out how you work under training, under pressure, and in crisis situations. And being slow, by the way, let me close by this: being slow in the building with smoke, or being slow when going systematically through a problem that that we have on the aircraft is one of the most important tips that we have. And actually, I find myself telling people that are very good at what they do that they would be even more effective if they would be slower, which doesn't seem logic, but that's the way
Exactly.
it is. Because being fast or being hasty has a lot of disadvantages and can be actually detrimental to the effects that you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, thank you for that. I also have learned my lesson. Um, as a researcher, we always get the question, can we automatize everything? Can we automatize early warning systems or even sending out, alerts? And there is a degree where the processes can be automatized, or you said before, standardized, yes. But then, where in your case does human judgment remain irreplaceable, actually? You mentioned that a lot of your procedures are standard, but then where is the human factor, again, irreplaceable, and you cannot automatize it or substitute it ultimately?
Mm. Yeah. So yes, I understand the question in the sense that we have a lot of automation. I mean,
Hmm.
the airplanes are full of automation. And by the way, also the environment we're working in, our planning and operation steering environment is full of full of automation. And automation has a lot of advantages, but where are the limits of automation, and where are the limits where automation can help us, or where is the point where automation will actually hinder us and will be a problem for us? And that is one of the things we're constantly working on. So one answer is that automation is only as good as the one who programmed it, right? I'm not talking about AI now, but I'm talking about the standard sort of automation that we have built in our airplanes of today. And the 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 parts that are automated in our systems are interconnected. So they talk to each other, right? Which is good. So the sensors know what the other sensors have been measuring, and we have automated systems that should help us or will help us cover a lot of tedious tasks that we don't want to do by hand. So, for example, an autopilot will help us steer the aircraft effortlessly for us on with general commands. We can tell them the direction. We can tell them follow this flight plan. We can tell them to hold an altitude, stuff like that, which would be a lot of effort if we had to do this all by hand, right? Now, autopilots can malfunction. So with all the help that we can get from automation, we need to have a certain surveillance for the autopilot. Now we can put a piece of automation on top of the autopilot that does autopilot surveillance. And if the autopilot is malfunctioning, this piece of equipment will tell us autopilot malfunction, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Now this piece of automation can also fail. It can give us false warnings, or it can not warn us when it should. So I guess you see where I'm getting at.
Yeah, yeah, true.
Automation is very helpful, but it has its own sort of failure modes and failure cases. And the human being will then be changed from the guy that steers the airplane into a guy that supervises automation. And that's basically the history of the last 30 years of aviation. We have more and more automation that helps us. And if all works fine, then we're in very good shape because automation will do most of the tedious tasks and the things that take a lot of effort away from us. And all we do is supervise and program and make sure that
Hmm.
everything runs smoothly. Now, every now and then, these combinations of external factors of whatever comes our way and automation results in a situation that is completely unknown or is is dangerous, if you want. And that's when the human being comes back in, and that's basically where we see the human being as somebody with oversight, with experience, and with the possibility to reduce automation. So all the big manufacturers of civil airplanes these days agree that if your airplane is not doing what you want it to do, then you need to reduce automation all the way back to the situation where you actually steer the airplane by hand. So that's one way of going about systems that are automated and may malfunction in their automation state, but may also malfunction because of external factors. Now, all of this is only possible when somebody in the cockpit, or by the way, for any other case in an organization or in the preparation for flights or whatever the situation may be, is aware of it. You have to see it. You have to be able to understand that something is going wrong. And this is the very first task that we have. We have to know that something's wrong. And I guess we're not alone with this, but that's something we try to train a lot. Because if we're not seeing what's happening, if we're not seeing the indications that something's wrong, then we won't be able to act on it. Mm-hmm. And that's still, at least in my world, that's still a very human thing to do. So, for example, to make a very simple example, if you don't see the cloud that can be dangerous for you, mm-hmm. you won't be able to act on it. So you need to be able to see that. And with all the automation we have, we should have a radar picture that's painting red in front of you. So you should be able to see that. But if you don't, for some reason, because the automated radar is not working or is in a different mode or whatever the problem may be, the human being comes in. Mm-hmm. So with the limited sort of integrated automation that we're dealing with, this is the first and probably the most important part for the human being.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. No, I mean, I fully agree with you, and this would be also my answer, because ultimately, who is bearing the responsibility or the consequences of the decisions? And the decisions have to have a human component, or someone that judges and takes ultimately the leadership on specific decisions. So I'm glad to hear that it's also for you the same case. Would you mind sharing, because I've been your student and I know that you have tons of incredible stories, but just for the sake of the audience, would you mind sharing maybe a small story from your career where you really felt under pressure and you had to take a decision, and then probably how this developed?
Maybe first of all, I've been a pilot for a long time now, and I consider myself extremely lucky because my career has been very boring. I haven't had any spectacular events that needed some Chuck Norris-like reactions, and I saved the world and myself and the plane and everybody. And I consider myself lucky, but I also consider myself lucky to be in an environment that has prepared everything so well that it didn't even come to the situation where I would have needed my superior skills for that. Now, in a smaller way, there have been situations. So one story I can share is that I was trying to fly to Chicago on the famous 9/11. So I was taking off in Zurich, and we were flying basically halfway through our flight to Chicago. We got a message that said, it looks like the US airspace is closed and there have been crashes of airplanes in the US. And the the first task there is, as I said earlier, is to see the thing, whatever the thing may be. We didn't know what was happening. We didn't know if that was serious. By the way, my first reaction was, we got this thing by a written message that we have, sort of a fax message, and my first reaction was, somebody has hacked the system, is trying to find out what we can do with it. So that was my first reaction. So the first task is to find out what really is going on, and do we have to act on it. So that is the sort of pressure that is at the beginning. We need to find out, is there anything in it for us? Do we need to act on it? Then, of course, was the question, what should we do about it? With lots of suggestions we get from different sides, which were disagreeing, by the way. Dispatch in New York told us to go there, and dispatch or the network operation center in Zurich told us to go somewhere else. So we had to make our own minds with a very limited state of information. We didn't know anything, and except for those papers. And so that was the sort of situation that asked or called for a decision, and that's what we tried to do. And that's where, as I mentioned before, the systematics that we teach and we learn as a pilot comes in for a situation that hasn't never been there before, and by the way, hasn't been afterwards.
Yeah,
There's just a unique situation at that time. So that's the sort of pressure we try to learn to work with, and hopefully, and that's our goal, is that the systematic that we use in that situation is useful and works for situations that are new, that are unheard of.
Thank you for that. So I would like to move now from the individual perspective to the organizational perspective. And for that, I turn to Michael. So Michael, in the energy sector, here too, reliability is expected every day because people need energy 24/7. But the operating environment actually can look a bit different, as Christoph mentioned before. Here we are dealing with critical infrastructure, many interdependencies, public expectations, and close coordination with authorities and partners. So if we take a scenario such as a blackout, we immediately see that it's not only a technical problem, and it can quickly become an organizational, political, or societal challenge. So from your perspective, what does crisis management look in such an environment, and for a big organization such as yours? I know that you have a very interesting presentation, and also I'm looking forward to the question of blackouts, especially in Switzerland. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. You can see my presentation?
Yes, it works.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And we have multiple aspects I'd like to respond afterwards to Christoph. That was very interesting, and I think we have a lot of aspects in common on it. But nevertheless, in first, I'd like to bring you in some basic information that you probably have to know about Oxbow and the energy system, where I can refer to afterwards. So just give me some minutes. I'll try to be short so that we have enough time to discuss afterwards. Oxbow, as you mentioned it, is the biggest energy producer in Switzerland, about 40% of Swiss energy production in all over kinds of production. So we own and produce on nuclear power plants, water power plants, wind, solar power plants, and biomass, and so on. So quite in the whole thing. We also have about 10,000 kilometers of distribution grid in Switzerland. But that's the Swiss part. On the other side, we have we are an energy trader in around 30 countries and over 40 markets around that. And that's the interesting thing. If you're working in the energy sector, it's very broad. It's very diverse on it. And crisis management in a nuclear power plant is something other than on a grid or in a trading market system. And that's what's interesting for me as well. But nevertheless, we stay a bit focused today as an example on the grid, on the electricity grid, and therefore just to know how this grid works in Switzerland, but in every other country quite similar. We have on the left side the production, where you're...
Sorry, Michael. We just see the presentation in the draft mode. I don't know if you can share it in the presenter mode.
I tried to do that, but probably it didn't work. Try it again.
Okay, yeah. So now we see it. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I think
You...
this way it works perfectly. But you just need to go with the slides. Yeah.
Okay. So
Thank you.
you're seeing now on that way.
Yeah, we are on slide 3. Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, and if I switch now, you see the switch.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Good.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah. So then let's do it like that. Okay. We have the production side on the left side. It's doesn't matter what kind of power plant you have on that side. And then in Switzerland, it goes usually quite fast to the Swiss grid net. That's the Netzebene 1 or grid level 1, where are the biggest grid distribution lines which are going through the European grid net. And then you have different substations until you are on the lowest grid level where you receive your own energy for your house. And Oxbow is quite in the whole part of it, from the production until the grid level 2 until the grid level 6 down. It depends a bit from where on it. And here we have the grid control center, which has the job in everyday's business to keep the frequency of the electricity grid on 50 hertz. And that's quite a job, actually, because you never know what is happening. So if you are switching off your own photovoltaic on your rooftop, then it's not a big problem for the grid. Then it's 0.0001% of the production which we are losing. But if we are losing the production of a nuclear power plant in Switzerland, then we are losing from 1 second to another about 10% of the production in Switzerland. And then it has a huge impact on it. And to level it out again so that we are staying at 50 hertz, that's the job of the energy grid control center on it. And that's something that was 20, 30 years ago not very complicated, because the grid was very unilateral. We had some big power plants like the hydropower plants and the nuclear power plants, and they were unilateral, bringing in the energy to your house and to the different industries. Now we are talking about a completely different grid, where we have very much more power plants, small power plants on the system. We are integrated strongly into the European grid, which is very good, but brings also other uncertainties as well. And so today we have more than 200 or 300 such manual and or automatically systems where they have to make sure that we are staying here on the same frequency. And that's something which can be done automatically for sure, but as well it's very humanly because you have to check what are the consequences on it, and that's something we don't see as a consummate. We just have power, and we are and one of the stablest power systems we have over Europe. So as a consumer, you have about 8 to 10 minutes of power loss per year. That about 6 of them are planned because there are some technical repair works that has to be done and are planned, and about 4 minutes are unplanned because of technical issues on some parts of the plant, and that's quite nothing. So we are usually aware that we have power every time. And that's something we are hoping that we can keep that up, or we are working every day to keep that up. But that's exactly what you were telling us before. It just vanishes. So we all know that our power grid is working, that we have energy the whole time, and that this is a lot of work, and that this is a loss of thing of a lot of people, that this is working. That something is that we are probably vanishing. So what are we doing if something is not working? We have a security framework on different levels. That starts on the bottom line of this slide, where we have emergency organizations on the different assets or in the different countries of Oxbow. So if there is a technical problem at a substation somewhere, we have there the specialists, we have there the emergency organizations, the technicians that solve the problem on it. On the same level, we have in the power grid system the so-called N-1 system. That means every important knot we have in Switzerland, every power plant we have in Switzerland, every substation we have in Switzerland can be compensated if it is lost by a second one. So we have a redundancy on it on the important knots. That mustn't be the same for, sorry to say it, but not so important knots. So if you are in a small part where there isn't a lot of critical infrastructure, then it can be that we have just one grid line that goes there. But for every important knot or interconnection, we have at least this N-1. Then on the divisional level, on the operational level, we have the emergency organizations which are coordinating emergencies on the operational level. So if there is something to be managed on grid level in Switzerland or all over Oxbow part, then we have the Energieleitstelle, the grid control center, which is coordinating that through the whole grid system. But still, we are talking here about isolated emergencies on operational level. We have that on grid level, we have that on the different power plant level, we have that on trading and sales level, as well as important emergency organizations on group level, as for IT, for example, or communications. If that's not enough because the emergency brings in problems of multiple divisions, or bringing out problems which goes beyond this operational level, then we have the possibility to bring in the corporate crisis unit as coordination gremium for the whole group, which connects then also to some external specialists. And let me bring that here on another a bit complicated slide. I'm sorry on that, but it brings in, I think, a bit the picture of the operational resilience approach we're trying to follow. So on the top on it, we have here the arrow of the daily business, where we always try to stay on it. We are strengthening the resilience through structural measures. That means, for example, by physical security, by health and safety, by business continuity management, business continuity plans, to strengthen this daily business way on it. On the same time, of course, through training in crisis management and emergency management on the operational level, that brings in the tranche of that as well. So this first arrow on it, that's just daily, and the goal is to build up and train the resilience maturity through preventive measures. If something is happening, we are talking about three different levels. The first one is incident. An incident is something that is happening locally. If your laptop isn't working, if software isn't working on it, but it has no bigger operational impact, then we stay here on the incident level. For that, we have professionals in the different parts of it. They work through their own leadership rhythm. They taking in their decisions, taking in the measures, and the incident never explodes into a bigger problem, and we go back and stay on daily business level. So that then would be an avoided crisis. And here you see the same as Christoph mentioned before. That's one of the big things. So it has to be recognized in time. You have to have the correct picture on it, what is happening. You have to have an issue management where you see what could happen and what are the KPIs to be sure that you recognize problems in time. That you're doing most likely through a risk management and the situational awareness. If the incident management is not enough, then you probably go to an emergency. That can be a fire on a plant, that can be an IT incident, a cyber attack, whatever. For that, you have on the operative level the emergency organizations. They have ideally prepared business continuity plans for that, and they have an emergency management for that to minimize the impact of the emergency, solve it, and go back on it. If it's bigger and it has impacts not just on isolated operational questions, but also on questions like reputation, financial loss, communication issues, and multiple divisions, multiple aspects of Oxbow are at this problem, then we're talking about a crisis or a catastrophe, and then we're talking about crisis management. So that is something that hopefully quite never is happening, because we try to avoid it at any cost, so that we are staying on incident or emergency level. But we have to see when we are going to the crisis, and then we are going to the crisis management team on it. So that's probably something I'd like to discuss afterwards with Christoph. He talked about crisis management in cockpit. Out of this point of view, we have a totally different approach. What is crisis management and what is in emergency management? And I'm curious how they divide it, if there is a division on it afterwards. And let me take some last aspects of operational resilience on your way, where I think, or I've had the experience, which are important on it. And I will go on a deep dive on all these four in quite a second. The first one is you need the right structures and the escalation path, so that you know where you are and who you need when. Then we are based on a very strong cooperation system. So we have different emergency organizations inside Oxbow, but are working very fast together with different emergency and crisis organizations through the different nations we are working with. And these are blue light organizations, these are federal authorities, regulators, and so on. And this requires very much the same language. That is something we always are struggling a bit on all the organizations, because if you have different people on different aspects, everyone has done a different instruction on crisis management, then you have 20, 30 different structures and different processes you have tried to bring in together. The third point will be the questions of redundancies. Where do we need redundancies? How are we doing this? And what's the possibility to really do that in an economic way? What is affordable and what not? And the last point is like we've heard before, in the end, you can have a lot of automation. In the end, it's still humanly. And I think it's good. It's that way. So putting people's training at the center on it, that would be my last aspects. And I switch this slide because I think we already mentioned it enough. Just it's another point of view. If you're seeing on the escalation path on the right side, you have the risk management at the start of the escalation path. So what is happening and anticipating, bringing in the situation picture, bringing in the situation development, and bringing in some mitigation action. That is something we have to fulfill every day before something is happening. And then it depends with different staffs and different organizations to escalate through the concepts of emergency BCM measures and or crisis organizations on it. Let's switch to the second one. This cooperation requires the same language, and that's something I really liked very much because, as you mentioned it, I started my career in military, more or less, where we have a very strong, a very clear leadership cycle with the so-called 5+2 system, where you start with problem identification and finish up with the decision making and giving the orders on it. And that's something that in the military is trained by multiple tenths of years now, quite in the similar way. And I brought that in by heart, by all my training in it. And when I switched afterwards to police, it was very similar. It was not exactly the same, but it was very similar on it. So I could, without any problem, adopt on it. If you're switching to private sector afterwards, then it's a bit different. It depends very much with whom you're working with. And I tried to adopt one of the important ISO norm, the 22361 crisis management, and adopted that to the military leading cycle. And it works quite well, but it's a constant work we have to try that we are talking the same language on all the different organizations. And we are not just talking about Oxbow Insight here, we are also talking about a lot of different partners we have to work together with, and some of them are here on these slides. So we have to work together with federal crisis staffs, with cantonal staffs, with grid operators on national level, with international partners, with own communication partners, but also external communication partners, different emergency management on the different levels, owner, board of directors, employees and relatives, and blue lights organizations. So bringing all these together and try to find a common language in emergency and or crisis situation. That's something that probably all these partners on this slide are always struggling still a bit. Redundancies, where and how. The first one is the leading ability on the upper side left here. We have redundancies on all levels. So we have redundancies on the digital level, where we are working on crisis management tools. On a very easy part, I started with quite complicated staff tools. They are on the market. There are multiple staff tools on the market, but usually I made always the same experience. They are too complicated because they are just used for emergencies and crises and are not used on a daily basis. So if you're using them only in exercises one or twice a year and never in daily business, it won't work. You won't have the possibility to bring in all your staffs to really work with them. So I stay on daily tools, normal office tools, where everyone in a staff is working on a regular basis. It's probably not the most efficient one because of automated processes, but it's something that everyone can work with on a daily basis. We have the same on an analog system. So we are doing the very same templates we are using on a digital way on two different systems as well on a third paper and pen solution at last. We trained it last year as well. That's one of the point. We have a system called COLIT. That's a scenario catastrophic loss of IT, where we are just training for that moment where our completely IT is went south. I don't hope that this will be at any time, but nevertheless, we have to be prepared even for that. We have the same that on the crisis room level. Usually we are working on crisis and emergency management on a hybrid way with people in the office and at the same time on a virtual basis. And I think that will be, as long as the technical situation is working, it will be also the thing how we are solving crisis and emergency in real thing. Nevertheless, we have crisis rooms to work fully operational on two different sites through our concerns. Business continuity on the upper side left. I can't make a full instruction on business continuity management. It's just to mention that in business continuity, you are not preparing for every incident that could happen. You have first to define what are your most critical processes that could fail, and what are you doing if these most critical processes are failing. So we have to define a minimal acceptable operation system so that you can bring to talk in the language of Christoph, probably just bring the aircraft back safe to Earth, and that's the minimal acceptable operation, probably like that. Operational redundancies on the other side, that's a very interesting question, because there lies the money. We have, as I told you, these N-1 systems. So every transformator who fails can be replaced by another transformator in another substation. Every power grid line that is coming down can be replaced by a second one, which is already operating. But what if two are failing? And that's even the point if you are talking about deliberate attacks, and that's something we can probably afterwards discuss a bit more. The whole system is brought on this system, so we have N-1. And what if that's not enough, because a deliberate attack goes against two transformators or two power lines at the same time. That's something we can discuss on Oxbow level. That's something we have to discuss on federal level. That's something we have to discuss on political level. How much security and safety do we want in our system, against which risk we have on it? And the last points, and we come back here on the human. Here are the key functionaries and authorizations, which functions, which persons, which key functions we need at any coasts, and where do we need here the deputies. And that brings me to the last aspect here, putting people at the center. We can train a crisis and an emergency team as long as we want. They are human. They have families at home, they have relatives, and they are working in critical situations on it. We always have to bring them in as well. Only if the families and the employees know that the working environment we are bringing them in is safe, that we are doing everything we have to do to bring them safe, they will bring their mission critical operational readiness we need, and come to work as well if an emergency or a crisis is happening. We are providing security through training. So that starts by clear role books. What are the jobs they have to do, by a constant and a good basic training on it, and then practice, practice, practice. Bringing in different scenarios, bringing in different exercises to train the people and to make them think what could happen and how we would react on that. And to switch to the last point on the right, what if it happens? It's not just a training. You have to be prepared. What are you doing if it happened? Here are some points. The care work we have to prepare, but also some logistical aspects like food, accommodations, transport, parking, internal communications. Very humanly thing. Then you probably won't find on a handbook, but these are the things that are coming out of experience of the real world. And then go back to finalize my points and going to some discussion thesis. These are two questions I'm getting often asked. The first one, is a blackout likely in Switzerland? The answer would be no, but we are on a very fortunate place all over Europe. We are in the center of the European power grid. The European power grid was founded in Switzerland, in Laufenburg, and we have over 40 connectors through our neighboring countries. That makes our power grid system very reliable and very resilient. That was, for example, the problem where we had a regional blackout on the Iberia Peninsula last year. They are connected by two lines to the rest of the European power grid because out of their geopolitical situation or geographical situation, one of these two was in maintenance mode, and the second one was quite fast überlastet on that. That was one of the problems, that they weren't able to connect it quickly enough to the rest of the European grid afterwards. There we are a bit in a better situation. All these brings us to a very quick frequency regulation ability. Our hydropower plants in Switzerland, we have about 40% of the power production in Switzerland is through hydropower plants, and this is like a battery. So you can switch them on and off in seconds, and through that you can control the frequency quite well in Switzerland. The integration of the European grid is part of the upcoming Swiss EU laws, and the Swiss energy producers are very very keen of it and are looking forward that these laws will be adopted to Switzerland as well, because it's needed that we are part of this European power grid, so that the boundaries are gone long ago on this sector, and we are part of the European network here very integratively. There are other things where we have to look in the future. We have a problem of a not in my backyard mentality at the moment. And that's something that will brings us to more and more problems in the future. We know that there are about 45 terawatt hours missing in 20 to 30 years when our nuclear power plants will be shut down, and we don't have enough replacement on it, then we will have a problem. We know that. There are 20, 30 years left. That's nothing if you know how long it takes to build new plants, to bring in the whole system, and there we really have to go forward. If you're interested in it, go to the energy reports produced by Oxbow on the internet. You will find different scenarios there. And yeah, that's the blackout thing. And the bit smaller thing is that you probably have seen the media reports about Berlin, about the local blackout after a deliberate attack against the power systems in Berlin, with about 50,000 people without power for multiple days. The question is always, can this happen in Switzerland? Yes, it can, without any question and very easily, because the power grid is not designed to be protected against people. It is it is built to protect people against. So all these all the boundaries you have between, they are that no one is walking through a transformator and getting grilled. So that's the physical security we have built on multiple tens of years during the last peacetime. And now we are talking about questions of if the power grid could be attacked deliberately in the future. And if we have to protect the system against that, then we're talking about a completely different do. So that's something we should and have to integrate the critical infrastructure. And I'm not talking only about power grid. I'm talking about all the critical infrastructure we need in Switzerland for our secure life. And we have to integrate that in a holistic security and safety approach. And probably we also have to learn to live with less than 100% reliability in the future, because if deliberate attacks could happen, we cannot afford 100% security in critical infrastructures. All of us wouldn't want to pay these taxes to build in a secure critical infrastructure concept against all possible attacks. So I think for that, I skip on it and then leave it so that we have still some 20 minutes to discuss.
Yeah. No, wow. Thank you so much for this, Michael. You answered again a lot to all the questions that I had prepared, and that's amazing because also for me as a researcher or academic, I can still learn new things. I was so grateful that you really reduced the resilience of the system to 4 components, and you talked about having the right structures and escalation paths. That's one thing that we always preach about. Cooperation requires the same language, and especially in a country such as Switzerland with 4 official languages, but also not only the language itself, but also knowing the same concepts, speaking about the same topics. That's also a very relevant aspect. Ultimately, redundancies, and as well as training people, so people being at the center. Looking at these 4 aspects, what does really work well in Switzerland today, and where do you think are the main weakness where we actually should put a bit more effort into reinforcing this, since you have this broader perspective and you talk to so many different, not only individuals, but also organizations and even institutions.
I think let me pick out 2 points
Yeah.
to go down. The first one is probably the common language and integrated security approach on it. If we talk to people, or if we are reading media articles, then we are hearing a lot of we should do more for the army, or we should do more for the police, or whatever, and that's everything correct. That's everything correct. Everyone has in the system, or in the actual changing world, very important things on it. But if we want to bring in a holistic resilience approach, then we have to integrate much more than that. And we have also to talk openly what are we not willing to do, because it will cost us.
Michael? Maybe I think his connection just...
Europe is not to
Okay.
is not to really make Europe or make democracies are not affordable. Because we have such a system that we are that we want that everything is working for 100% for the whole time, and probably we just have to adjust that, because we can't pay for that on it. But there are things that we have to do, and where we have to be better on it. So that's probably the first point. And the second point is exactly this point. We have to talk about what are the risks, in the future, and what do we want to do on critical infrastructure on that.
Thank you so much for this twist. Given the fact that we are at the Center for Security Studies, these are exactly the type of questions that we try to bring forward and have discussions about. I don't want to take more time from the audience. Lisa has forwarded me one question, and you, Michael, already illustrated it very well. And you actually had the same question, which is how do you differentiate between emergency and crisis management in the aviation sector? Since Michael, you already showed us on the level of a plane, it might be a crisis. So normal problem-solving methods fail, and there is a high risk of negative outcome. So a plane crashes, but wouldn't an engine failure, for example, rather be handled with standardized emergency procedures? So the users asking, so it's saying that they would rather relate crisis management with the airline itself and not necessarily with the plane. How do you differentiate between emergency and crisis management, both on the level of plane and our airlines, if not the aviation sector itself? And this is really a good question, differentiating between emergency and crisis management, because we also briefly talked about it. And in the Blue Light organization, I feel it's the hardest component, because you often focus on saving people or reinstallation of the services without realizing that maybe even a small problem can lead into wider consequences that have to deal with trust or communication, as Michael just showed us. So, Christoph, could you give us a bit your perspective on this?
So, I guess from what I read on the slide, on Michael's slide, is the definition of a crisis would be a long-term issue, and the emergency would be a shorter-term issue. Is that correct? Is that how you define that?
It can be, yes. So the difference is in emergency, you have to act immediately on it, because there are people at risk. There are something on it. And crisis is on a broader perspective. These are questions on financial impacts. These are questions on communicational questions, on reputational impacts, more on that, but also on coordination, of course, of probably different emergency aspects which are coming in the similar, because if you have a blackout situation, then you have on the same time an emergency situation on grid level and probably also an emergency level on trading and sales, because the systems aren't running anymore, and you have the whole thing as a crisis on corporate level.
Okay. Yeah, so I have an easy answer. Being a pilot, I can tell you I don't care about crisis. I don't deal with crisis. That's probably too short an answer, but it's sort of true, because long-term problems, let's say the Iran war now is concerning airlines, but as long as I have my fuel to get to the destination as a pilot, I'll be okay. So see the shortcut that I'm making, which is not fair, of course. The thing is that as a pilot, I have to deal with all sorts of emergencies, and everything is my responsibility in terms of safety and security until I land the plane and everybody's safe and has left the plane. But from there on, there might be a crisis going on around us, and that's not my responsibility. That's then the responsibility of the organization. And yes, crises have impact on operational planning, and then can feed back into our daily operation and the flights. So it's not as easy as I said at the beginning, but that's how we differentiate between crises and emergencies. And because you said it, Jürgen, dealing with an engine failure or is basically one of the scenarios that have been integrated into our procedures. Now, coming back to what also Michael said, first of all, you have to realize there is an engine failure. And if there is an engine failure, you have to make sure that's the only problem you have. So most of the time, if you identify a problem or an emergency firsthand or in the first instant, then you might miss something else. So the procedure is there for an engine failure, but are you sure it's the engine failure or is it just an engine failure? And the other thing I might mention here is that if you're dealing with an emergency, just like Michael said too, you might end up in a crisis. So even on a flight, long-haul flights are susceptible to that kind of scenario. If you have a passenger that's getting sick, you first of all have sort of an emergency. You have to deal with a sick passenger, but it might end up being a crisis for your flight because you don't know how it develops, and options to help the patients are limited as long as you're flying. And so the crisis might be sort of the long-term prospects of the patients weighing against the short-term safety and security concerns for the flight. If we land with our patient, which has happened, by the way, many years ago, but if we land with a patient that is sick on an airport that's very limited in research in resources, like Churchill on the Hudson Bay, that was the case that we had, then you have hopefully an emergency solved and the passengers in some sort of hospital or medical care, but you might end up in a crisis for the company because the airplane is stuck at the place where we are. So the crisis management is left to organizational levels on a first view basis, but it's not that far away from what we're dealing with in the cockpit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Michael, do you have any comment to this?
No. Absolutely
No,
agree.
no. I also just find it very interesting what you just said, Christoph. Well, I don't deal with crises, I deal with emergencies, and that's also completely fair. And it's good to also realize and understand that. Michael, maybe turning to you, do you want to share with us maybe a story or from your personal experience, a situation where you actually had to activate your crisis structure within Expo? When did that happen, and then how did the procedures actually follow?
Um, yes, uh, that's probably the good thing to mention our alerting structure. Luckily, we didn't have to activate the crisis team for it, and let's hope that it stays that way. But the activation of an emergency team, that's quite normal that we have that on it. And we have a middle thing on it. So let's bring in the situation we had last year. No, it was 2 years ago again on the Misox, where we had some quite strong storms and problems on our hydropower plants. If we activate an emergency team, a local emergency team, and the divisional emergency team, then we have the so-called security alerting team between in the middle. That's myself with 2 or 3 colleagues, and one of us will pick up the phone then when the emergency team is called up, and we are then in um, in the middle function to coach and help the local emergency team, and the same to decide if this is something that could become a crisis or not, if we should call up the crisis team or not. And these are more than once. So this Misox was one of them. Then the second example that I can remember is CrowdStrike. You probably heard of that as well, an IT supporter, where we had multiple IT problems on it. And the third one was the Iberia blackout situation. That was very an interesting case because we are active on Iberia on different level, and there were about 8 hours out of power, and this was very interesting to deal with that. The good thing was it went quite well. So all the business continuity plans we had on this case, they worked. Even some very improvised plans we had on that worked. So let me bring you one example. We had a trader that we had to bring in to a different location where we had emergency power system on it, and it was planned, it was known. So he has to go there to work if our own office would be out of power, which was the case on that thing. And that worked because the local chief financial officer took the trader on his motorbike and drove him to the different location. And after 30 minutes, he was up again and running. So yes, it was improvised, but it was planned like that, and it worked. So, and that means these are the things that you can learn out of the experience.
Thank you so much for this. Also, it shows again that we can plan, but often it's also improvised planning. Just maybe one last question, short, before everyone goes for lunch. This is a question for both of you. So, what role does individual preparedness play and means for you, but also for your organization? Maybe like very few small key takeaways.
Christoph, you want to start?
Ah,
You're on mute.
you're muted. Yeah.
There we go.
Perfect. Yes.
So on the level on the question of preparedness, we check every pilot twice a year if he's ready in the simulator. And by the way, there's more checks, but twice in the simulator we check them if their training level corresponds to the regulations. That's one thing that we do on an individual level. As an organization, we have our emergency control center that has regular trainings being done based on scenarios that are limited to the airline, or sometimes they are bigger and encompass the airport and other airlines. So we do that. Some of it is mandated regulatory, is a regulatory mandate, and is being checked on by the Bundesamt für Zivilluftfahrt, the FOCA, and some of it is not mandatory, is like additional training that we do, but down to the level that the pilot is prepared for his next flight, that is also mandated and is sort of a personal responsibility. And I believe in general that being prepared is probably one of the best things that we can do to avoid using our crisis management or emergency management skills, in that a good preparation will always lead us to detect anomalies earlier than if we are not prepared, and that keeps us from using bigger scale measures to solve a problem if we avoid it in the first place.
Great, thank you. What about you, Michael?
Yeah, I think that's quite similar. And to sum it up, probably the question is always, or the important thing is you have to be clear with your employees what is expected for them in their role. That can depend vary. So a picket engineer in a nuclear power plant, he's trained very well. He's checked by the regulator multiple times per year that he is up and fit for his job. That's the one extreme on the one side, and on the other side we have on the corporate crisis team not a picket system. We have a best effort system. They are trained, and we have every function twice to three times, and we do not have a picket system where they have to pick up, but we know they will pick up, and if one of them is picking up, then it's enough. So we have on this level, it's just a best effort system. And on the other side, we have a very regulated system with picket systems. That depends very clear on the role, but you have to be honest with all your employees. What are your expectations?
Thank you so much for this. So to sum it up, preparedness, yes, is essential, is vital, and this can be mandated by regulations, but also enforced internally through clear structures and clear communication, and ultimately leading to best effort. So I thank you, experts, so much for today's discussion. It was very useful for me personally, and I'm sure also for the audience. Please feel free to reach out bilaterally if you have our emails, I'm sure. And I will talk to you soon. So have a beautiful and enjoyable lunch. So enjoy. Bye bye. Thank you.